possibly.
I think you stopped sharing your screen, by the way.
I did stop sharing my screen, which I think I needed to do to record, but I will go back into the screen share in just a moment. I don't, yeah, that should work fine. Before we do that, let me also share a link to a spreadsheet that Kevin has just created, or rather a document where we can keep lists of attendees. And, you know, if you wouldn't mind, what we'll do is get you to write your name and where you come from on the sign-up sheet. And I'm just going to type for 1 second, and then I'm going to paste in a link. Okay. Now I'm going to try pasting a link into the chat here. And if I do it right, everyone should be able to see the link. And if you wouldn't mind, just follow that link, sign up there, and then I will resume the screen share. Okay. So I said I would do 10 minutes or less of introduction to CDS hooks, and I just do this to make sure everyone's on the same page. Can someone confirm that my screen is now visible?
For Josh or Kevin, but I'm getting that spreadsheet in a view only.
Kevin will update that to make sure that it's world editable.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool, awesome. Yeah, give it 30 seconds and then, okay, already done. Fine, give it 3 seconds. Yeah, if you just hit reload, it should work now. And can someone confirm that my screen is visible?
Yep, can see.
Okay, and I know that there's a little gray area at the top of the screen that is being taken over by WebEx, and I will try not to put anything important in that gray area. So very quick background on CDS hooks. What is it and why are we here? I've done a lot of work over the last years, making it easier to plug apps into EHRs and working with the standards community to try to build tools that support things like plugging a smart app into an EHR. And it's been a lot of fun to see a community of developers beginning to build cool stuff. We have a gallery where we highlight some of the stuff that's been built, and it's been especially gratifying to see commercial EHRs and open source systems beginning to support the integration of these apps into real products. So we saw a number of EHRs showing the same set of apps at HIMSS this year that run unmodified within real commercial systems. We've had great participation through the Argonaut program to get support for the FHIR API and for OAuth and app integration, and a lot of really exciting work that's happening. And this is really has been the focus of my work over the last 6 years. But at the same time, while apps are extremely general, and it's cool because an app can do anything, and many good apps will take one small job and try to do it really well, there's a limitation with these apps is that the users have to sort of know when to click them, when to launch them. That's the basic mode of operation here. Javi, thank you for joining. You seem to be sharing your video with us, which is now taking up my whole screen because of something that I've done. Sorry, that seems to be my fault. Okay, we're back. So there's this limitation with apps where users have to know when to start them, and you have to ask to run the app now. And so while apps are very general, there's some user interface integration that we would like to be able to do in a deeper way. There's places in the UI where most of the time we have nothing to say, but occasionally we really want to tell the user that something important has happened. So CDS hooks is a solution for this problem. It's a way to build into the user interface of an existing EHR system a standards-based way to call out to decision support for a particular purpose. And the basic model is that we instrument the EHR. We consider the EHR to be a generator of events or these triggers. So a user will do something. Some activity will happen based on what the user does in the EHR. For example, the user starts to prescribe a med. And when that activity happens, we trigger what's called a hook, a call to an external CDS service. And we're basically announcing this event to the external service. So for example, we'll say Josh is writing a prescription for metoprolol. And then it's the job of this service to respond synchronously and quickly with some information that the user might want to see. Now, it's always valid to return no information, and that's probably the most common thing that a service will do is to say, that's nice, thanks for letting me know, I've got nothing to tell you right now. But in some cases, the service will have information. And we model this using a user interface concept called a card. And a card could either just contain some text for a user to read, we call it an information card, or it could contain a suggestion, like something else that the user might want to do, like switching to a different medication, or it can contain a link to run an app. And this is really exciting because now we have a way to suggest apps only when they're relevant for a particular patient and for the activity that a clinician is trying to get accomplished. So I'll show you the 3-minute demo of an environment that uses these kinds of hooks. And this is just an open source demo page that I built last fall to show this idea off. And thank you to the RX review team who took my very plain vanilla demo and actually spruced it up with colors and the appropriate fonts and all this cool stuff, so it looks a lot snazzier now than it ever used to. But this is an example of 2 different activities that you can do in this sort of mock EHR. You can write a prescription, or you can view a patient record. And in this case, let's say I'm writing a prescription. There's some debugging information off to the side showing what it is that I've written so far. And it's expressing this prescription as a FHIR resource, but it's not really a real resource yet. I haven't written the prescription. I'm just in the process of writing it. And this is sort of a view onto what it is that I'm in the process of writing. So what happens is when I choose a drug, let's say I'm going to choose a drug like ondansetron, an anti-nausea medication. As soon as I pick a dose and a form, my prescription gets updated here, and the EHR generates an event, generates one of these triggers to an outside service. And in this case, it's a pricing service that's responding with a card with some information on it about the cost of the drug. The service says it's a $56 prescription. And that's just there for me to see. As a clinician, if I want to use that information to make a decision, I can. If I want to just leave it there, that's fine too. That's an information card. Or I could do something more sophisticated. Let's say I'm writing a prescription for the brand name version of this same drug, which happens to be quite expensive. In this case, the pricing service tells me it's going to cost $1,300. And by the way, you can save $1,200 with the generic. And the pricing service actually includes a button. It includes a suggestion that's tied to a button here that's labeled change to generic. And what happens is the pricing service got this FHIR resource showing what I was in the process of prescribing, and it can come back with a counter proposal, a different FHIR resource, which will differ only by the drug itself. And there's somebody with a bunch of background noise. If you're able to hit mute, that would be good. So what happens is when I press this button, the EHR is going to read that counter proposal and update the user interface with that suggestion. So when I click it, this word Zofran here is going to go away because I'll be on the generic instead of the brand name. And when I do that, the whole cycle starts again. We call out to the service, and now I just get the price of the generic drug. So that's an example of what we're calling a suggestion card. And then the last thing, which is kind of interesting, is what we call an app link card. So for example, if I say that I'm going to prescribe a drug because of a patient's hypertension, I want to treat high blood pressure. When I choose this treatment intent, the FHIR resource gets updated with the reason of essential hypertension. And then a service responds with a card that says, we know how to manage hypertension according to the Joint National Commission guidelines. And we've built an app that could help you apply those guidelines right now. And if you want, you can click on this link to launch an app. So this is an app link card. And it launches a web application. It just opens an arbitrary URL that the external service provides. And if you click on it, it takes you to the external web app, which in this case is just being hosted at smarthealthit.org. And the web app can get information from the FHIR API about who the patient is and what their blood pressures are and how old they are and what diseases they have. And then it can take me through a decision tree, which in this case is a very short decision tree with just 4 options, but it could be arbitrarily complicated logic and interaction. And at the end of this decision, I'm going to say, you know what, yes, I want to take your first suggestion here. The thiazide sounds like what I'll use. And then that sends me back to the EHR and updates the EHR to prescribe the recommended drug that I chose, hydrochlorothiazide. And now the app link card has been updated here to say that we're managing the patient with this external app. So that's an example of a way you can launch an external web app, and it returns with a decision that the user has made. And in this model, it's the EHR's job to apply these decisions or even to ignore them as it sees fit. All we do is we provide a way for an external service to say, here's what we suggest, or here's what the user said they wanted. And then I still haven't written the prescription yet until I click the sign button in my EHR and finish the job. So these external services are only making suggestions for the EHR to either take or leave. That's the basic model of interactions here. And then in terms of how it works under the hood, we use a set of FHIR operations called CDS hook. And we define the data model for how you notify this external service about what the user activity has been. So in this case, here's what we send to an external service. I won't go through all the details, but you tell it what activity is the user doing, who is the user, what patient record is open, what encounter, and then we send along some contextual information like the draft prescription that I'm in the process of writing. And then the external service responds back with a set of these cards according to this data model here. So a card can have some text, it can have some links, and it can have some buttons, which are the suggestions. Again, I won't go through all the details of the model, but this is the basic way that the CDS hooks specification functions. And it's designed for synchronous calls. It's designed to augment the user experience of the EHR while the user is doing the job and could use information that's going to matter right now. That's sort of the set of problems that we're geared towards addressing. So we've done already some exciting work in this space. We hosted in January a Connectathon track at the HL7 Connectathon, which Kevin Shackleton from Cerner co-hosted with me, and we got a group of, gosh, probably 15 people at the HL7 meeting in Orlando working on building out CDS hooks implementations. So we had Kevin building out an implementation inside of the Cerner EHR, when we had folks from a number of clinical decision support companies and healthcare provider organizations, including folks from Premier and Elsevier and Boston Children's Hospital, Intermountain Healthcare, RX Review, and I don't see what was then Navinet on the list here, but there was a large team from Navinet or NetHealth as well. So there was a very good turnout, and we got people building a whole set of hooks, which today are still available to try out in our test harness. I won't show you what they all look like, but if you hit the configure button here, you can see there's several screens full of different hook definitions that various groups have built, and you can turn each individual one on and off. This is kind of a debugging interface. Please.
This is Ken. Has there been much Epic participation in enabling these hooks within their system yet?
So the question is whether there's been participation from Epic yet. I think the answer is we've got someone at least on the call. I saw Isaac Vetter on the list of registrants for today's call. So when we get into what EHRs are these working in and where could they go, that's the discussion that we're here for right now. As far as I know, the only EHR where there's been actual work to implement to date has been inside of Cerner. But let me pause and see if anybody wants to correct me and tell me that they've actually gotten started already. Okay, that's fair. But that's the whole point of this kickoff call, is to figure out what are the parts of this specification where we can get some early agreement and think about getting implementations working across a few different vendor systems. Right now, the only two implementations are the isolated test harness that I've built and the interface that Kevin has built, which today runs inside of PowerChart. But I'm very excited to see, looking at the attendee list right now, that we have folks on today's call from Cerner, from Allscripts, from I'm trying to figure out, from Athena Health, thank you, Chip. Other EHR vendors that we have represented on today's call?
Hello, this is Isaac from Epic.
This is Matt here from Epic as well.
Great, thanks guys. So we've got at least a couple developers from Epic, from Allscripts, Athena, Cerner. Anyone else that I left off of that list on the EHR side? Yeah, so from my perspective, 4 is certainly a critical mass, especially if we've got folks interested at those 4 vendors. I don't want to assume anything about who wants to participate in what yet. I'm just happy folks are on the line today, learning a little bit more and willing to talk through what it might mean to participate. So other questions, basic questions about the goals of CDS hooks before I dig into what I'm thinking about in terms of an implementation program?
Sure, this is Ken. One more question. Have you ever thought of another potential way to hook is to hook out from the rules engine within an EMR? So in Cerner's case, it'd be hooking out from Discern Expert. In Epic's case, it'd be calling out from the rules engine, best practice rules engine. And I'm asking that in particular because Epic provides that kind of functionality. We found that to be really, really nice. And I think if I guess from one question is, like, if everybody did what Epic already provides in a production mode, that would be really awesome. And could we incorporate that into what's considered here?
And I think to extend on Ken's point, subscription to various programs or these apps, I think, would be key. I think having that interim layer where there is a rules engine that determines subscription model before hitting actual apps or decision service external services, I think would help as well.
And who was that, please? I was just wondering,
was that
was that just happening after Ken?
Who was that?
Sorry, I was saying if there was a additional...
No, sorry, we heard you. We were just wondering who it was.
Oh, sorry, this is Manoj Sharma from Allscripts CDS team.
Cool, thanks. So yeah, I think overall there's an interesting set of questions about how these kinds of technologies interact with rules engines. The basic premise behind CDS hooks here has been that standardizing the way a rules engine works is hard, and there are some kinds of decisions that you can't easily express using rules. So for example, if you develop a machine learning algorithm with a neural net for classifying patients by risk score, we don't think that you're going to be able to easily describe a standards-based rule engine that's going to be able to execute an arbitrary neural net with, whatever feedback properties or machine learning techniques are in vogue next week. So our focus has been on something that's in some ways more general and in some ways more specific. But the model, of course, here is that you could, if you have a rules engine inside your EHR, you could use that rules engine, for example, to decide when a particular hook was worth calling. So rather than calling out 1,000 hooks all the time, we might need some ways to limit which ones we call. So rules engines could play an important role there. And then also you could build a decision support service that wraps around a rules engine and abstracts that from the EHR. So I think there are a number of interesting opportunities with respect to rules engines and EHR functionality. And my hope is that if we draw the lines correctly here in this specification, we'll be allowing people to explore those opportunities and then not limit what they can try. I don't want to get too much into the design, though, because I think what I want to do is highlight open design questions in this session and then talk about how we could use the implementation program as a way to rapidly iterate on some proposals and prototypes. Are there other questions about the basics of how the CDS hooks specification works today? So let me talk a little bit about how I would love to see the community working together towards a set of shared goals here, towards a set of goals that are going to help us get consistent decision support running where it matters inside of the EHR, and to get to the point where a decision support services company can build one service that'll integrate without modification across a relevant and large set of different EHR vendors. And the different EHR vendors might have totally diverse underlying technology, database engines, rules engines, and the goal here is to be able to call out to a service in a consistent way and incorporate cards from that service in a consistent way. So what I'm imagining here is something that I'm labeling as a CDS Hooks Sprint program. And it's modeled a bit after what we've done in the Argonaut work group, and I know many of you have participated in that world, and many of you have not. But very briefly, it's a way to set up on a sort of week-by-week or month-by-month basis some shared goals as a community that we can work towards together. And by doing this kind of development across organizations, but in sync, we can figure out where we have shared questions or we might have a differing understanding of how to accomplish a particular goal and then talk through those issues when and where they matter. So at a really high level, the goals of this kind of sprint program in CDS Hooks would be, number one, to promote a way to create clinical-grade service integrations between EHRs and external CDS services, a way for us to get some early implementation experience integrating these services with real-world systems. So doing it in a test harness or a demo server is nice, but what I'm hoping to accomplish with this sprint program is working with some real EHR vendors and figuring out what are the parts of the specification where there's willingness to try these things out. Because the goal then is to be able to refine the specification, to focus on the parts that work and balance the parts that are easy to use and flexible, and at the same time balance those goals with stability. And so there's no better way than an iterative process to accomplish that kind of refining and to base it on some real-world experience. And then finally, we'd like to be able to drive towards real pilots where we put these tools in front of clinicians and actually are able to start measuring results. It's not something we get to do that often in healthcare IT, but I think it's at least important to think about as a high-level goal when you put advice in front of a clinician about better choices, better drugs to prescribe or better orders to make. Can we actually change clinician behavior, and can we actually change patient outcomes? I don't think we'll be measuring those things together as a group over the next 3 months, but it's important to think about what those questions would mean so that we can begin driving towards an ecosystem where you can take those kinds of measurements and do those kinds of experiments. Because in many real-world deployments of decision support, when you try to measure outcomes, they just don't make a difference. And it's sort of a perplexing result, and it's one that I would love for us to be able to get more insight about as a community. So technically, what does all that mean? I talked about some very high-level objectives. What does that mean technically? Well, there's a bunch of parts to the CDS hooks specification today that work in our demo environment, but they need work to make sure that they are suitable for real-world deployment. So I'll highlight a couple of them for folks who are familiar with these issues, but I won't go into great detail on any of them. So one question is, we have built into the specification a notion of something we call pre-fetch, a way for a service to tell the EHR ahead of time what data it needs. So if you're building a service that does drug dosing for children, you might tell the EHR, I always need to know how tall a child is and how much the child weighs and their body surface area, for example. So prefetch is a way for the service to tell the EHR what it's going to need. One of the basic building blocks of CDS hooks is that we have the FHIR API available to us. So a service could always just call into the EHR's FHIR API when it needs data, but the goal of prefetch was originally to speed things up if we needed to speed up. And then once we had designed it, we realized there were some use cases where the EHR might not have a FHIR server that's online. And so it becomes an interesting question to say whether we could just package up everything an app needs ahead of time. But there's real open questions about how often we need this and how do we define the expectations so that servers and clients can agree on what they're going to get. That's one open design issue. Another open design issue is the question of how apps or services should be publishing their metadata, the information about what it is they do and when they are relevant, when they should be called, all those kinds of things. So earlier on today's call, when I was showing this configuration screen, what I did for our early demos was I asked every app developer to generate a snippet of JSON like this and then submit it to me in a pull request on GitHub or paste into a spreadsheet somewhere so that I could gather all these little snippets in one place. And that was fine for a one-day Connect-a-thon that we did in Orlando, but it's not fine when you want to synchronize many different EHRs and many different services over time, and things like the URLs and the names and the data requirements will be changing over time. So the notion here is that we want some way to expose metadata so that a hook doesn't have to paste around a snippet of JSON all the time. Capture that stuff in a common way. So we have a proposal or two on the table right now about how to expose those metadata inside of a service. And one of the technical objectives for this sprint program would be to rapidly evaluate those options and pick one and make sure it works.
Hey, Josh, comment there.
Yeah, please.
Led an effort to look at all the metadata standards for DISN support, quality measurement, that kind of thing. We've published an informative model, and now it's incorporated as a FHIR-based metadata that Bryn's been working on. So I would suggest using that as a baseline to see if it would work.
Okay, well, if you want to add that to the list of proposals, it would be good for us to be able to evaluate along with the other two that are on the board right now. The two that are on the board right now use the FHIR conformance statement to capture the metadata about what hooks you use. And then there's the second one is just a hook metadata operation where a hook just lists a very short number of things. This is the metadata we seem to care about right now. It's the name, the description, the activity, and the prefetch template. And the payloads are quite small and easy to work with. So we want to make sure that we can evaluate the various options and pick one that's going to work. So other open questions. Right now in the CDS hook specification, we use something called the parameters resource. in FHIR to convey data back and forth between the EHR and a service. And so, for example, I'll show you on the CDS hook operation page. Josh, talk about what these parameters.
Josh, in the previous question where we are evaluating different options, can we have like a little discussion forum or some kind of forum mechanism where people can add their thoughts for the evaluation?
Yes.
Because
yes. So I'll talk about the collaboration sort of techniques and tools in just a moment, and it's a great point. But yes, the idea is that for any one of these questions, we want to have a place to discuss it and informally take a straw poll and pick something. And so I think we'll be using a lot of GitHub, and we'll be doing some real-time chat through the chat.phir.org site. And using those two tools together, I think we'll have a reasonable way to collaborate and capture the decisions that we make. I just wanted to highlight a couple more open issues. So there's this parameters resource, which is in FHIR sort of a generic way to put a bunch of key value pairs together. And in FHIR, the parameters resource is kind of verbose compared to the way that most common JSON works, because everything is broken down into a name and a value. And so you've got this list of name value pairs. And it sort of makes sense, and it's easy enough to process. It's just a list of JSON objects, each of which has a name and some kind of value. But in practice, if you were just doing this with straight JSON, you wouldn't actually bother to make this into a list of name value pairs like this. You would just have one much shorter JSON object, which used these names as the property keys and used these values as the values. And so there's been an open discussion on our mailing list today about whether it might make sense to simplify that representation, maybe just for CDS hooks or maybe for FHIR more broadly, to have a condensed representation of that JSON and then to use then payloads that looked a bit easier. That's just another example of an open question. We're not going to decide on this on today's call. I'm just trying to highlight things that are outstanding. Another issue is about security. It goes in two directions. One is when an EHR calls the outside service, it wants to provide to that service a way to request some more data. And so right now we have a specification where an OAuth token is generated at the time of that call, and then the external service can use it to get some more data back from the EHR. And then we also have a requirement for authentication in the other direction. Some services need to be able to authenticate the EHR that's calling them because, for example, they only want to expose data to certain trusted EHRs, and other EHRs, they might not want to respond to. So that's the other direction of the security protocols. And today we haven't actually specified a solution in that direction yet. So that's an outstanding issue. And then finally, there's I shouldn't say finally, but the last one on my sample list here is an issue of what goes into our activity catalog. So earlier on the call, I said that these hooks are generated when a user performs certain activities, like opening a patient record or prescribing a drug. And what we've created is an activity catalog that tries to list these activities. And we started off intentionally very small with only 3 activities in our catalog. The activities are prescribing a new medication, reviewing a set of orders, and opening a patient record. That's called patient view. And we started with those because we thought they were quite common as activities across different EHR systems. And we thought they were a high-value place to be able to plug in some external support. But over time, we'll want to build this catalog out with more high-value additions. So, for example, we've heard folks asking whether it would be possible to generate an activity that was, I'm in the process of doing a patient discharge, or an activity that says, I'm in the process of checking a patient's eligibility for insurance. And, there will be dozens of these things in general, but we want to be able to...
When you were showing hypertension and then it pulled up the guidelines, what activity was that using?
So all the demos that I showed you earlier were using the medication prescribing activity, and the notion was I was in the process of prescribing a drug where I had chosen a treatment intent of hypertension, but I was still writing a prescription. I just happened to fill out why I was writing it.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, this is Ron Dahlgren with Stanton Health. Just 2 quick questions about the open design questions that you discussed. Firstly, the prefetch behavior. Am I understanding correctly that this would be when, for instance, a service federates with an EHR, it would say, hey, these are the things I'm most interested in, and then if it wanted to, the EHR could kind of proactively go ahead and build up state nuggets that might help with processing? Is that the idea there?
So I think that's right. The only place where I'm going to pause is where you use the word state. And I just want to be clear that the prefetch data are something the app could have asked for itself. There's nothing special or particularly stateful about it. It's just the EHR is going to gather those things and send them to the app rather than making the app ask for them. In general, the process of calling one of these hooks is in response to a user activity, which does represent a kind of EHR state. But the prefetch data in particular are just whatever data you have in your Fire server that match a particular query.
Okay. And then secondly, the activity catalog items. This really leaps out to me as something that you may want to leave as extensible in whatever system's implementing the CDS hooks specification, because the workflow granularity is really going to vary by EHR, and that's like the workflow granularity is the most important place to put a lot of these hooks on.
So I appreciate the comment, and I agree with it 100%. So in the activity catalog we have today, we're pretty explicit that these are an extensible list of activities, and what we do is we try to define some that we think are going to be common across systems because it'll help early CDS developers build something that's going to have the widest possible use. But this is not a closed set, and we make it easy for anyone to suggest new activities, or you can just have private activities that you agree on with a particular EHR vendor and never publish them anywhere, although we like to think that publishing them would probably be a best practice. But one way you can see that these are extensible is each activity is actually a Fire coding, meaning it has a system plus a code. And so if you want to be in our official catalog, you use this system. But if you want to build some private or internal catalog, you can just build activities with your own system assigned to them and either publish them privately or internally, or maybe even not publish them at all. And that's perfectly fine.
I see. Yeah, it's not so much about keeping things hidden and proprietary, but more like negotiating with the EHR to get the tightest possible integration into the workflows they expose.
Yep, totally. And so many of those may be particular to one or a small number of EHRs, and that totally falls into the model here. But it's not our initial focus as a group because we want to focus on things that are the most broadly applicable to as many people in the group as we can.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Josh, this is Matt from Epic. If I remember our conversation, this is going to be still a synchronous, or at least from a workflow perspective, a synchronous call, right? Have we had discussions on how we are going to ensure that the response time expectations of a clinician is met?
Yeah, so it's a great point. We say that these are synchronous calls, and we have guidance on the wiki today about sort of how long they should generally take, but it's very loose guidance. I think we just sort of talk about some number of milliseconds. Maybe we don't even. But yes, the notion is that we want these things to be returning in a small number of milliseconds, maybe 200 or 300 at the outside. And the degree to which we can achieve that in the real world is an open question, and it's an important one. Practically speaking, there are some tools that we can apply. We can just say if your service doesn't respond within a certain amount of time, the cards won't be displayed. Those are the kinds of things that I would love to think through as a group about what the guidelines should be and then what the acceptable behavior should be around slow responses. So it's a great example of a technical objective that I think we would want to tackle in a group like this. So what
about like the error behaviors, identifying the error behaviors? For example, if a clinician might get used to a particular service already returning them some service, and for whatever reason, if the service is not available, would they expect some kind of notification that it's not available rather than the patient doesn't met the qualification? So identifying those differences.
Sure, it's a great point. And so guidance along all those kinds of reliability questions, I think, is an important set of issues that we need to address. Let me talk about how we can address some kinds of error conditions and describe what I think of as a model for collaboration. So I've created a set of, let's say, straw man definitions that I think give us a sense of the kinds of things that we could work on together here. So I've created a page in the wiki, which I apparently created so recently that I forgot to link to it anywhere. But it's a page called Sprint Ideas, and it lives here. And I'll add a proper link to it when we get off the call here. But anyone who wants to find it can look under the Pages link here. But this was an idea that I had put together about how we could sequence some work as a community together into a set of sprints where we could get some early experience very quickly and also work through technical issues as we go. And so the notion here was that the sprints would focus on three major areas. One would be infrastructure, and this means building things like testing tools and test cases and services that we think would be broadly applicable to a lot of app developers. We've got a great community on the phone here today, and if we could tap into even a little bit of the developer resources from folks who sort of need to build these things anyway, I think we could get a lot done in a collaborative, open source way. So in terms of infrastructure, I've tried to go ahead and define, a half dozen or so smallish tasks that could be done to make it better for the whole community, to make it easier to test and validate services. So for example, in each of these sprints, I've listed a set of infrastructure tasks, like somebody can build a repository of test cards on GitHub. Could just set up a GitHub repository and try to include some valid but tricky cards that were missing data or combine things in strange ways or attempt to have a cross-site scripting injection into the HTML that would highlight security issues. And we could build out this repository of test cards over time. It could start with just a few, and then every time something new came up that no one had thought of before, we could create a test case around it and put it in that repository. So that's an example of an infrastructure task that I think would really benefit the community if we had it. And then once we have a repository of these kinds of test cards, we could very easily build a small web service to host these cards. It would act like a CDS service, but it would just do a very simple job of taking test cards and just returning them wholesale. And that would allow, those two things together would be kind of the building block that EHRs could use to begin testing their services against a whole bunch of potentially tricky cards that might be hard to handle. And we'd get common implementation experience that way. Another thing that we could do to make life easier for people building CDS services is to build out an API around a mock EHR environment, something like a CDS invoker, whose job was to call CDS services the same way an EHR would. And again, here, the goal is just to try to highlight components that would be useful for testing purposes, and if we had them, would save time and improve reliability across the board. This is not supposed to be a complete list of the kinds of things we might have, but just trying to be very concrete about a few that we could build.
So Josh, just to understand that, you already have the hooks.find.me. Isn't that the CDS invoker? Are you expecting it to be enhanced, or are you thinking of a new one?
So I'm thinking of something a bit different here when I say a CDS invoker. What I mean specifically is something that would be, rather than a user interface that a person would have to click through, something that could be fully automated and something that could be incorporated into an automated testing suite, for example. So I think having a user interface as a demo that looks more like a real EHR is great, but we also need some testing tools and APIs for testing. So then in addition to the infrastructure components, with each sprint, I've laid out a set of goals that an EHR participant would want to meet and that a CDS service participant would want to meet. And again, these are just notions today, but we've taken this kind of model and been quite successful with it in the Argonaut community. And I think we could do the same here. So for example, in the first sprint, the easiest thing that an EHR developer could do for that sort of hello world is to call a service when a patient view activity occurs. So like when you open a new patient record, and then only support the simplest kind of card, which is to display text, in an information card. And then CDS service participants would build a simple service that just responded with information cards to display text when that patient view activity occurred. So that's an example of staging implementation. So we start with the easiest stuff where we've got the most agreement, and over time we work through.
Hey Josh, another question as we talk about sort of sprints and what's easy. Are there any sort of similar capabilities that are available within existing commercial EHR systems we can leverage? So specifically, I'm thinking of Epic's approach where, like CDS, invocation, et cetera, they already have a framework for this and for fetching common kinds of data, that kind of thing. I'm wondering if we could, especially with the EHR vendors on the call, if there's any sense of, are there existing like production grade stuff that we could just adopt to or adapt to fulfill some of these approaches?
So I guess I'll pause and see if any of the EHR folks want to answer, but I think maybe the goal here for me is to use the open standards that we're building through FHIR to provide a consistent way to be able to share those data.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is, can we take, obviously, if you know, for example, if CCDA is currently being used as the data format for EPIC, which it is, then that you know, we may need to translate, et cetera. But I'm thinking, is one way to expedite getting production grade support from commercial EHR vendors is seeing if we can align with what they already do in terms of similar / related functionality. I'm quite familiar with that.
So let's in terms of what we could expedite to work with the vendors, let's have the vendors tell us where they see a value and what they might be willing to work on. You know, I'm definitely open to pragmatic solutions that are going to get us where we need to go, but I don't want to, you know, assume that we know what the solutions are. I'd love to hear from the vendors about how much of this stuff they see as either practical or plausible or worth exploring. So let me pause at this point. I won't go through the details of the other sprints, but I'll encourage folks to take a look at what they might be. I would love to hear from the EHR vendor side about whether you'd be willing to try supporting some of this stuff, whether the approach seems vaguely plausible, general feedback. And maybe I'll call on people by name first, rather and then open up to the overall group, because I know we have some folks by name. Maybe I'll just do it by vendor at least. So is there anyone from the Allscripts side who would comment on this? Kelly, Ken, or Ryan?
Josh, this is Jeff Danford with Allscripts. I can speak to the service. I mean, we are definitely willing, from the service standpoint, to have it ready to go and accept the hooks. We've got a couple of folks on the call that are with our EHRs that would be actually applying these pieces, and I'd ask them to say what they think their schedule will be like. But I think we can do it at least from the service piece.
And this is Ryan. I'm from the Allscripts Professional EHR product. A lot of us, this is our first time really seeing this. This was handled by, you know, we have different departments within our group, and they were part of the earlier conversation. So maybe for the EHRs to comment, at least on the Allscripts side, would be a little early.
Fair enough. Do you know who the right people are to get in touch at this point?
I'm the correct person to get in touch for my product.
Cool. All right.
There are several EHRs that make up the Allscripts product. So, but I'm at least the correct person here. But yeah, if this is our first time hearing it, I know that the FHIR initiative has been mentioned several times, and it's something that as a company we're interested in doing. But as far as like being able to commit, hey, let's all start on May the 1st, whatever, it would be way too early to commit to something like that.
Cool, that's totally fair. So thank you for joining on today's call and getting some background, and I know it's a fire hose of information if you haven't read through any of this stuff before. Let me see if Chip is on the line from Athena.
I am, and I'm going to forgive your fire hose pun.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll forgive you. Actually, it's still up in the air. So right now, this is an approach that we're certainly looking at very closely because it aligns very much with how we are thinking about this particular problem anyway. Like whoever from Allscripts was just talking, the actual timelines as to when we'll be doing this are still somewhat up in the air. I'm working on it from much more of the API and the FHIR side of things. The actual integration into the EMR is the piece that I can't speak to the timing of. I'd love to know the answer to that question, but I can't speak to the timing of quite yet.
Fair enough, thanks. Either Matt or Isaac from Epic?
Really quick, Josh, I think to elaborate on the Allscripts position as well, same thing, we're engaging products as well as the Common Components API piece as well. So similar to what Chip just said, we'll probably tackle the API side first and then wait to integrate with the products as they free up their time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be a common thing with all of us, is that making the APIs, because it's very much in the background, will probably go much faster. It's the getting products, and we have the advantage, we can actually get the stuff out the door. You guys, you know, have to ship software and so forth. But that's going to take, that takes a while for any of us to do.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point that, you know, one of the promises of a technology like CDS hooks is that it actually is an end-to-end solution. It cuts all the way from the data layer up into the user interface and sticks links and buttons in front of people. But you're right that it's an organizational challenge to make sure all those groups can work together to bring a pilot into a working stage. So I appreciate those comments. Is there someone from Epic, Matt or Isaac or anyone else who would make a comment?
This is Matt. Isaac and I have been talking about what we can do on the CDS hooks front and on the guideline appropriate ordering profile front as well. And Ken mentioned the best practice advisory web services framework that we have. We are actually thinking along that same lines of, in the ideal world, integrating something like this in the best practice advisory framework would be the right thing to do. Unfortunately, bandwidth is one of our limitations because we have other projects too that are right now in a priority phase. So at this point, we are not in a place where we can clearly say this would be a time when we can start working on, but we are internally looking at this, and we have played around with small prototypes, etc. as well. We are not really comfortable saying we can commit to so-and-so a date at this point. That's our problem.
Well, fair enough. And I lost my alphabetical order. Kevin at Cerner, I know that you are actually actively working on some support here, but will you comment as well?
Sure, yeah. So obviously we're very interested in CDS hooks, and we're committed to, I mean, we showed it at the Connectathon that you mentioned, and then also at HIMSS. We're going to continue with that, and I personally want to see us kind of flesh this out more, because we think it's obviously there's a lot of interest, a lot of people here, and so we think that this is going to be something that we would love to incorporate into our EHR. On the comment on the, like, if there's any like existing tools that a vendor has, like any tools that we have that we could leverage here. So in all the work that I've done in implementing this on Cerner system, I haven't seen, at least in our space, any of our existing tools that we could leverage outside of Cerner. Like, not because we don't want to share it, but it just doesn't, nothing that we have seems to be useful outside of Cerner. Like, we couldn't make it vendor agnostic.
Thanks, Kevin. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to open up the conversation as well to folks on the service development side, because it takes both sides to create the ecosystem. Are there questions or comments from others on the line that we haven't heard from yet?
Or Josh, do you mind if I jump in for just a sec?
No, go ahead.
And so Kevin, I was on mute. I was trying to respond to you 10 seconds ago. So I think that what Ken was pointing out was, in terms of an internal maybe business process rule engine that's used to generate clinical decision support type alerts or best practice advisory type alerts, how do we, is there a way to, or I mean, and you can, feel free not to answer this question. Is Cerner integrating CDS hooks or pulling, accessing services from, external CDS service providers or engines? Is that being integrated in with some type of internal business process execution system or rule engine that already provides internal best practices or clinical decision support guidance? I think that's really the point that Ken's trying to make, and as Matt referred to, I think that's the challenge for Epic, to use an external CDS system or a spec like this, and the problem is that the data that we're retrieving isn't really discrete. The data we're retrieving is at the UI level, and so that doesn't really lend itself towards actually being well integrated into an existing rule engine.
Okay, yeah, I totally see what the question is now. So the way I've implemented CDS hooks into Cerner system is leveraging our existing decision support engine. without that, there would be no way for me to hook things in as easily as I have been able to. So we're definitely leveraging our existing rules engine and kind of platform. On your comment around the data being available just in the UI, that is a big challenge for us as well too. And everything that I've done really doesn't, based upon the current activities, I haven't had to take much out of the UI and pass it on to the CDS service. However, we're going to quickly reach a point, depending on the activity or the data that's requested that doesn't exist in the EHR, so the kind of the pending data or the in-progress data from the user, at which I'll hit a kind of a big challenge. We're talking internally how we're going to handle that, but we still think that there's a lot of use that we can get out of CDS Hooks, or a lot of value that our clients would get based upon some kind of basic stuff that doesn't require information that the user is inputting in. So, like for instance, the use case at HIMSS with the bilirubin app, where from Intermountain, where they look at a patient when the chart's open and look at some existing observations that are charted, and based upon the patient age and those observations, they can return a card that says the patient needs to is at risk for their bilirubin levels. Like, so that's a good use case there. But I agree with you that there's. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Peregrine Marshall from ArcsReview. One of the other situations we've encountered is very similar in that sometimes we're bringing data that's not inside the EHR. We're basing a lot of the content of the CDS Hooks cards on data that's not readily available in the EMR, and we're able to draw certain conclusions. And so oftentimes is how can that data be piped back into the health system at large and be of use to them in an ongoing basis, which I think is kind of some of the things you were hinting at. And in some of those cases, what we end up having to do is work with the data warehouse, and unfortunately, you know, there's a lot of different ways in which people handle this, to pipe, you know, the data back into the health system through their data warehouse, maybe not directly into the EMR itself. Sometimes it's into the population health platform. So it definitely is sort of, it goes beyond the EMR, both in terms of the context of the data that's being used to drive the decision making, as well as the data points that are sort of the deliverable. And sometimes it fits really well within the context of the EMR, and other times it doesn't. And that's when you kind of get into a little bit more of some of the custom proprietary building that, you know, we're all accustomed to in healthcare.
Indeed. I appreciate that comment. Thanks, Peregrine. One of the challenges is figuring out what are the circumstances where we can potentially open up a lot of value without requiring deep integration and the ability to write back into these systems. And then how can we start peeling back the layers and beginning to build support for that stuff without blocking on it, without having a dependency on it. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think the two use cases that are the most, you know, common where it makes sense. The first is what Josh described, which is where things don't neatly fit. They don't neatly fit into algorithmically. They don't fit neatly into the context of an EMR, such as a neural net that's designed for a very specific purpose. The other use case that I think we're finding ourselves much more sort of relevant in this space, which is data that's just not available in the EMR, and that in our case it has a lot to do with cost data. You know, other examples we're seeing is off-site genetic assays, you know, that's not stored in the EMR, but we have some access to in some situations. So I think that, and unfortunately, you know, those are things that there's not a neat storage home for them in the EMR context. And so while it is ephemeral, you can provide somewhat ephemeral decision support at the point of care. Now, granted, it would be great if you could take all of that learning and store it somewhere helpful, but that's not always easily possible. So sometimes, you know, the best use cases are only at 50 to 60%. Are achievable only easily for the first 50 to 60%. Creating that full circle of information, you know, that last 30 or 40% of implementation, it gets very heavy.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes just a foot in the door can be good enough. I want to pause because we have only 2 or 3 minutes left on the call, and I want to just thank everyone and then outline a couple of next steps. So on my side, you know, I'm excited that everyone has joined today's call. I appreciate feedback from folks on the EHR side who are saying, It's still early. We're just learning about this technology, but it's interesting, and we have to figure out where it fits on our roadmap. In terms of concrete next steps, we'll be having another CDS hooks Connectathon session at the next HL7 meeting in May. And my goal is if we can get folks to participate in some of these sprint activities, and it doesn't have to be everyone, and it doesn't have to be completely synchronized. I think we can do a fair amount here by just laying out a set of issues in GitHub and then working together on a couple of core components. But I would like for us to work as a community between now and that Connectathon in May on working through these technical issues and coming up with what we think are at least a best guess answer to each of these issues that we've outlined under technical objectives. And that way, when we get to the next Connectathon, which will happen in Montreal in May, we won't be struggling to define a set of choices on each of these 5 tasks. We will have picked something, we will have built prototypes that demonstrate that it works, and then we'll be able to keep on going with real implementations. So I will take it upon myself and to work with the community to break down these technical objectives into a set of discrete questions where we can discuss them each in GitHub issues. We can have some live chat online and then work through them one by one. So with that, we're coming up to the top of the hour. Really appreciate everyone's joining, and I'm excited about figuring out the things that we can do together as a community to push this technology forward.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Josh.
Josh. Thank you.
So